Has the price you pay at the market today almost doubled compared to 3 years ago? And your salary? Has it doubled too? No. And right at this point, 2,500 years ago, a Chinese general addressed this very issue. But he didn't analyze it as an economic problem. He analyzed it as a strategy of war. His name is Sun Tzu. His book, The Art of War. And today, on this channel, we're going to talk about how what Sun Tzu wrote about the economics of war aligns almost perfectly with the economic realities we experience in the 21st century. When people hear the art of war, they usually think of strategy, deception, misleading the enemy. And they're not wrong. A large part of the book is about exactly that. But perhaps the least discussed and most important sections of the book are those devoted to the economic dimension of war. Sun Tzu, around 500 BC, said the following: "Winning a war is easy. The real difficulty is sustaining your country after the victory." When you hear this sentence, I feel like something starts forming in your mind. Because today, this sentence describes governments' post-pandemic economic policies, central banks' interest rate decisions, and how people's purchasing power has eroded. This video will be a bit different. It's not an academic lecture. You will feel as if you're hearing Sun Tzu's own voice. And in every line, you will think, wait, this is still happening today. The second chapter of The Art of War is titled Waging War, and this chapter may be one of the harshest economic lessons ever given in history. Sun Tzu says, "When there are 100,000 soldiers on the battlefield, and supplies must be transported to them, the cost can reach 1,000 ounces of silver per day." Now, pay attention here. Sun Tzu is not describing war. Sun Tzu is calculating the cost of war like an accountant. And he adds, "No nation has ever benefited from prolonged warfare, even if it is conducted wisely." Read that sentence again. Even a wisely conducted war, if prolonged. So even if you fight with the right strategy, the right leadership, the right decisions, if the war drags on, your economy collapses. Sun Tzu states this clearly, because the inevitable result of prolonged war is this: resource consumption. Now, pause for a moment and return to today. What did global economies do between 2020 and 2022 during the pandemic? Governments printed trillions of dollars. Central banks lowered interest rates. When were these decisions made? Right during the greatest economic war period. And the result? Inflation. Global inflation. America, Europe, Africa, all at the same time. Sun Tzu described this in 500 BC. In times of war, the rising needs of the army cause prices to increase. When prices rise, wealth is depleted. When wealth is depleted, the people are burdened by heavier taxes. Read that again and ask yourself this question. Is Sun Tzu describing today's economy, or is this a modern economist? This is where Sun Tzu's genius reveals itself. He could see not only the military consequences of war, but also its social and economic echoes. And the most dramatic of these was this: inflation is the silent tax on the people. Sun Tzu explains perhaps the most strategic economic idea in the book with these words: a wise commander feeds his army from the enemy. 1 unit of grain taken from the enemy is worth 20 units transported from your own land. What Sun Tzu is saying here is extremely clear. Do not exhaust your own resources for the heavy costs of war. Sustain yourself using the resources of your opponent. This principle is applied in many different forms in today's economic world. Does a country seize the natural resources of another country? That is Sun Tzu's principle of feeding from the enemy. Does a multinational company use cheap labor in a developing country? That is the modern version of the same principle, and even more interesting. When the International Monetary Fund lends money to indebted countries, what does it demand? Structural reforms. And what do these reforms usually lead to? Privatization of state assets. In other words, the transfer of a country's own resources outward, and then feeding on those resources. Sun Tzu saw this long ago. To win, use the enemy's resources. Preserve your own. Another key principle in Sun Tzu's economic thinking is speed. I have heard of foolish haste in war, but I have never seen a wise war that was prolonged. In economic terms, this means a wrong decision made quickly causes far less damage than a correct decision made too late. Think about this with real examples. When the 2008 global financial crisis hit, what did the Federal Reserve and the US Treasury do? within moments, they prepared trillion-dollar rescue packages for major banks. The decisions were controversial, criticized, even ethically questionable. But they were fast, and the economy survived. Now compare this to the 1930s. During the Great Depression, what did governments do? They acted slowly. At first, they believed the market will correct itself. Then they were forced to intervene. But by then, it was too late, and the world experienced economic catastrophe for a decade. Sun Tzu's principle of speed clearly illuminates economic management. In times of crisis, delay becomes a bigger problem than the crisis itself. Sun Tzu emphasizes logistics in multiple parts of his book because he knew very well an army without baggage is lost. An army without provisions is lost. An army without supply bases is lost. This principle corresponds directly to supply chain management in modern economics. Between 2021 and 2022, the world painfully learned how critical this principle is. Global supply chains collapsed due to the pandemic. Cargo ships waited at ports. Factories couldn't find raw materials. Store shelves were empty. And all this chaos fueled inflation. Because supply decreased, but demand did not. Sun Tzu had summarized this long ago. If logistics fail, strategy becomes meaningless. The same applies to economies. Even the strongest economic policies are not enough to survive when supply chains collapse. That's why today, the United States is so aggressive against China in semiconductor production, because semiconductors are the provisions of the modern economy. And in Sun Tzu's words, if you lose your provisions, you lose the war. One of the most famous lines in the art of war is this: know your enemy and know yourself. In 100 battles, you will never be defeated. If you know yourself but not the enemy, for every victory gained, you will also suffer a defeat. If you know neither the enemy nor yourself, you will succumb in every battle. The economic interpretation of this is very clear. If a country does not understand global economic dynamics and competing economies, it may produce flawed policies. But here's the interesting part. Sun Tzu doesn't just say, know your enemy. He says, know yourself as well. What does that mean in economics? A country must understand its own strengths and weaknesses. How resistant is it to inflation? What is the state of its external debt? Are its foreign reserves sufficient? Is it technologically dependent? Is its production capacity adequate? Economies that do not ask these questions and do not know the answers are, in Sun Tzu's words, in danger in every battle. Sun Tzu writes in chapter 6, water has no constant shape. In warfare, there are no constant conditions. He who can adapt himself to the enemy and succeed is called a genius. When you apply this to modern economic policies, what do you see? The most successful central banks and economic administrations are those that act according to changing conditions, not rigid doctrines. Should it be Keynesian, monetarist, orthodox, heterodox? Sun Tzu would say, which weapon works depends on the war itself. And in economics, which policy works depends on the economic context. But be careful. This doesn't mean try everything. Sun Tzu says adaptation is a disciplined process. Just as water flows downward, moves around obstacles, and never tries to flow upward. Economic policy must do the same. Insisting on policies that contradict reality is as meaningless as water trying to flow upward. One of Sun Tzu's least known but most profound warnings is about the burden on the people. In times of war, the people sell their carts and oxen and exhaust their wealth to support the army. 60% of the state's revenue is spent on war. Read those numbers. 60%, and the people lose their wealth. Sun Tzu is not giving these numbers to scare. He is warning, war exhausts the people. Therefore, keep it short. Win quickly, because every additional day increases the burden on the people. Bring this to today. How much has the United States spent on the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq since 2001? According to Brown University's Cost of War study, the number exceeds $8 trillion. $8 trillion. And that's only the military spending. When veteran health care, interest payments, and opportunity costs are included, the number becomes much larger. And who paid this bill? The taxpayers, the middle class. And look at this. The war in Afghanistan lasted 20 years. Exactly what Sun Tzu warned against. Every additional year multiplied the burden on both the treasury and the people. Sun Tzu saw this 2,500 years ago. In times of economic war, the heaviest burden always falls on the middle and lower classes. Not the generals, not the politicians, the people. Sun Tzu's strategy is built on deception. When you are strong, appear weak. When you are weak, appear strong. When you are strong, appear weak. When you are weak, appear strong. Are you ready to act? Appear as if you are not. Are you near? Appear far away. The economic equivalent of this principle is quite interesting. Some countries and companies are highly skilled at hiding their real condition. Large budget deficits are made to appear small in reports. High inflation is made to look low through revised baskets. Growth figures are pushed upward through changes in methodology. In Sun Tzu's language, this is the art of appearing strong when weak, and weak when strong. But here, Sun Tzu says something even more important. Deception provides a temporary advantage. Lasting power comes from real capacity. In other words, deception is a short-term tactic. In the long run, economies return to reality. The 2001 Argentina crisis, the 2008 Greece crisis, and many currency crises experienced by different countries. All of these are economic examples of the truth eventually revealing itself. In the first chapter of The Art of War, Sun Tzu defines 5 fundamental factors for evaluating war. The first is Tao. It represents the trust of the people. The second is heaven. It reflects timing and conditions. The third is earth. It refers to terrain and geography. The fourth is the commander. It concerns the qualities of leadership. The fifth is method. It represents discipline and organization. Now, let's apply these 5 factors to economics. Tao. It represents social trust and legitimacy. Do people trust economic management? Do they believe taxes are spent fairly? Without this trust, no economic policy can fully succeed. Heaven. It represents global conditions and timing. The right policy at the wrong time can produce worse outcomes than the wrong policy itself. Earth. It represents a country's geographic and demographic position. Does it have energy resources? Is the population young or aging? What is its export capacity? Commander. It represents the competence of decision makers, from central bank governors to finance ministers. Sun Tzu looks for 5 traits in a commander: intelligence, trustworthiness, humanity, courage, and discipline. Now imagine these traits in an economic leader. Method. It represents institutional quality. Is the central bank independent? Does the legal system function properly? Are regulations transparent? Sun Tzu says, "The one who evaluates these 5 factors correctly wins every war. The one who fails to evaluate them loses." The same applies to economics. Those who analyze these 5 factors correctly will, in the long run, always be on the winning side. So when you evaluate all of this, what do you see? Sun Tzu wrote these in 500 BC. Today, we are in 2026. More than 2,500 years have passed, and this man sheds light on almost all the economic problems we experience today. Prolonged economic crises consume resources. Inflation is the silent tax on the people. External resource transfer makes the strong even stronger. Speed is the key to survival in economic crises. Logistics, supply chains, are the foundation of everything. Without intelligence, market and competitor analysis, strategy is blind combat. And most importantly, the bill is always paid by the people. Sun Tzu reminds us of this. But he adds one more thing. The commander who foresees a bad outcome beforehand is the greatest commander. In summary, understanding these economic processes is not just an academic curiosity. It is understanding why your purchasing power is eroding, deciding where to allocate your savings, and planning how to prepare for the future. These are the realities of everyday life. Human flaws and weaknesses do not change. Greed does not change. Short-term thinking does not change. The abuse of power does not change, and a 2,500-year-old book can still help you understand all of this. Sun Tzu has one final message for you, and this message comes right at the beginning of the book, before the war even begins. The general who makes many calculations in his temple before the war will win. The one who makes few calculations will lose. The one who makes none at all will be destroyed. Sun Tzu is saying this: victory is not won on the battlefield. It is won at the table before the battle begins. Apply this to your financial life. How much do you earn? How much do you spend? Do you have debt? When will it be paid off? Are your savings protected against inflation? If an unexpected crisis hits, how many months can you survive? The one who asks these questions, who knows the answers, who calculates regularly, does not just survive economic storms. They do what the unprepared cannot, and they keep their personal finances standing strong. Do the math. If you enjoyed this video, And if you want to explore how the ideas of great thinkers like Sun Tzu apply to modern economics, by following the traces of history in greater depth, don't forget to subscribe to this channel.